"By the way," Rumata said, "who were the 3 prisoners you freed in the Golden Horseshoe?"
"Freed?"
The Baron stopped chewing and stared at Rumata.
"But, my noble friend, I must not have expressed myself clearly. I didn't free anyone. They were under arrest. It's a matter of state. Why in the world would I free them? There was a Don, probably a big coward, an elderly bookworm, and a servant."
He shrugged his shoulders. "Yes, of course," Rumata said sadly. The blood suddenly rushed to the Baron's face, and he savagely rolled his eyes.
"What? Again?"
he roared. Rumata looked around. Don Ripat was standing in the doorway. The Baron began to get up, knocking over benches and scattering dishes. Don Ripat gave Rumata a significant look and went outside. "I beg your pardon, Baron," said Rumata, getting up. "His Majesty's service."
"Oh,"
said the Baron in disappointment.
"My sympathy. I would never join the service."
Don Ripat was waiting just outside the door. "What is it?" Rumata asked. 2 hours ago," Don Ripat informed him briskly, "by the order of the Minister of the Defence of the Crown, Don Raber, I arrested Doña Orcana and conveyed her to the Merry Tower." "All right," Rumata said. "An hour ago, Doña Orcana died, unable to withstand the trial by fire." "All right," Rumata said. "Officially, she was charged with espionage, but—" Don Ripat faltered and looked down. It seems to me—" "I understand," Rumata said. Don Ripat raised guilty eyes at him. "It's none of your business," Rumata said gruffly. Don Ripat's eyes turned opaque again. Rumata nodded to him and went back to the table. The Baron was polishing off a plate of stuffed cuttlefish. "Pour me some Historian wine," said Rumata, "and let them bring more food." He cleared his throat. "We'll make merry. We'll make merry, goddammit!" When Rumata came to, he found himself standing in the middle of a large vacant lot. A grey dawn was breaking. The timekeeping roosters were shrieking in the distance. Cawing crows were densely circling over some unpleasant heap nearby. It smelled of dampness and decay. The fog in his head was quickly dissipating. The familiar state of piercingly sharp and clear sensations was settling in, and something bitter and minty was pleasantly melting on his tongue. The fingers on his right hand really smarted. Rumata brought his clenched fist to his eyes. His knuckles were raw, and he was squeezing an empty vial of casparamid in his fist. Apparently, after he had already gotten to this vacant lot, before he had turned into a complete pig, he unconsciously, almost instinctively, poured the entire contents of the vial into his mouth. The place was familiar. The tower of the burnt-out observatory loomed in front of him, and to his left he could see the thin, minaret-like watchtowers of the royal palace through the gloom. Rumata took a deep breath of cold, damp air and headed home. Baron Pampa had really made merry last night. Accompanied by a host of impecunious dons, who were quickly losing human form, he made a gigantic tour of the bars of Arkana, drank away everything, including his splendid belt, demolished an unbelievable quantity of food and drink, and got into at least 8 fights along the way. At least Rumata could distinctly recall 8 fights he had intervened in, trying to break things up and prevent loss of life. His later memories were lost in the fog. Certain images floated up through the mist: predatory faces with knives in their teeth, the vacantly sad face of the last impecunious don, whom Baron Pampa was attempting to sell into slavery at the port, a furious hook-nosed Irukanian angrily demanding that the noble dons give back his horses. Early in the night he was still an operative. He drank as much as the Baron, Irukanian wine, Estorian wine, Soanian wine, Arkanarian wine. But before each new wine he would furtively put a Kasparamid pill under his tongue. He still retained his judgment, and by force of habit noted the clusters of grey patrols at the intersections and bridges, and the outpost of mounted barbarians on the road to Soan, where the Baron would certainly have been shot if Rumata hadn't known the barbarian tongue. He distinctly recalled being shocked by the realization that the motionless rows of strange soldiers in long black hooded cloaks, who were lined up in front of the patriotic school, were a monastic militia. What does the church have to do with anything? He thought then. Since when does the Arkanarian church interfere in secular affairs? It had taken him a while to get drunk, but when he did, it happened abruptly, all at once. And when in a moment of clarity he saw an oak table cut in half in a completely unfamiliar room, a drawn sword in his hand, and the applauding impecunious dons around him, he did briefly think that it was time to go home. But it was too late. A wave of fury and repulsive, obscene joy at being free from everything human had already gotten hold of him. He was still an earthling, an operative, an heir to the people of fire and iron, who didn't spare himself or others in the name of a great purpose. He couldn't become Rumata of Estor, flesh of the flesh of 20 generations of warlike ancestors, renowned for their pillaging and drunkenness. But he was no longer a communard. He no longer had responsibilities to the experiment. He was only concerned with his responsibilities to himself. He no longer had any doubts. He was certain of everything, absolutely everything. He knew exactly whose fault everything was, and he knew exactly what he wanted: to hack them to pieces, set them on fire, hurl them down from the palace steps onto the spears and pitchforks of a roaring crowd. Rumata started and took his swords out of their scabbards. The blades were notched but clean. He remembered fighting with someone, but whom? And how did it end? They drank away the horses. The impecunious dons had disappeared somewhere. Rumata, he remembered this too, had dragged the Baron home with him. Pampered on bow was full of energy, utterly sober, and completely ready to continue the merrymaking. He simply could no longer stand on his feet. Furthermore, for some reason he thought that he had just said goodbye to his beloved Baroness, and was now on a military campaign against his ancient enemy, Baron Kaska, who had become impudent to the last degree.
"Judge for yourself, my friend. This scoundrel gave birth to a 6-fingered boy from his hip and called him Pampa. The sun is setting," he declared, looking at a tapestry depicting a sunrise. "We could make merry the whole night, noble dons, but military feats require sleep. Not a drop of wine during the campaign. Besides, the Baroness would be displeased." "What? Go to bed? What bed is there in an open field? Our bed is a horse blanket."
With these words, he tore the unfortunate tapestry off the wall, wrapped himself up to his head in it, and collapsed under a lamp with a crash. Rumata ordered Uno to put a bucket of brine and a tub of pickles next to the Baron. The boy had an irate, sleepy face. "He sure is plastered," he grumbled. "Eyes pointing in different directions." "Quiet, fool," Rumata said then. And something happened after this. Something very bad, which chased him all the way across the city to the vacant lot. Something very, very bad, unforgivable, shameful. He remembered when he was nearly back at home, and when he remembered he stopped. Flinging Uno aside, he had climbed up the stairs, opened the door, and burst in on her like her master. And in the light of the night lamp he saw a white face, huge eyes full of terror and disgust, and in those eyes a reflection of himself. Staggering, with a drooping, slobbering lower lip, with raw knuckles, with trash-smeared clothes, an insolent and loathsome blue-blooded boar. And this look threw him backward, onto the stairs, down into the hall, out the door into the dark street, and far, far, far away, as far away as possible. Gritting his teeth, and feeling all his insides freeze together, he quietly opened the door and tiptoed into the hallway. In the corner, resembling a gigantic sea mammal, the Baron was slumbering peacefully, puffing in his sleep. "Who's there?" cried Uno, who was dozing on a bench with a crossbow on his knees. "Quiet," Rumata whispered. "Let's go to the kitchen. Bring a barrel of water, vinegar, and new clothes, quick." He spent a long time furiously pouring water on himself and rubbing himself down with vinegar, acutely relishing scrubbing off the night's filth. Uno, who was unusually silent, bustled around him, and only afterward, helping the Don fasten a pair of idiotic purple pants with buckles on the behind, he informed him gloomily, "At night, when you took off, Kira came down and asked me if the Don had been back. Must have decided she dreamt it. I told her that you hadn't come back since you went off for guard duty last night." Rumata took a deep breath, turning away. That wasn't better. It was worse. "And I've been sitting by the Baron with a crossbow all night. I was worried he'd drunkenly try to climb upstairs." "Thanks, kid," Rumata said with difficulty. He pulled on his shoes, went out into the hall, and spent some time in front of a dark metal mirror. The Casparamid had worked beautifully. The mirror showed an elegant, noble Don with a face that was slightly haggard after an exhausting night shift, but eminently respectable. The damp hair, clasped by the gold circlet, fell softly and beautifully around his face. Rumata automatically adjusted the lens above his nose. They got to watch some pretty scenes on Earth today, he thought grimly. By now the sun had risen. It was peering into the dusty windows. Shutters began to slam. Sleepy voices were calling to each other in the street. "How did you sleep, Brother Kiris?" "Soundly, praise the Lord, Brother Tigger. The night is over, and thank God. And we had someone try to break into our windows. The noble Don Rumata was partying last night, I hear. His lordship has a guest, they say. There's no real partying nowadays. I remember in the young king's time they'd party, wouldn't notice before they burned half the city down. What can I say, Brother Tigger? Thank the Lord that we have such a Don for a neighbour. If he parties once a year, it's a lot." Rumata went upstairs, knocked, and went into the study. Kira was sitting in the chair like yesterday. She looked up and gazed into his face in fear and anxiety. "Good morning, little one," he said, came up to her, kissed her hands, and sat in a chair across from her. She was still looking at him searchingly, then asked, "Tired?" "Yes, a little. And I have to go out again." "Shall I make you something?" "No, thank you. Uno will do it. You could put perfume on my collar." Rumata could feel a wall of lies growing between them, thin at first, but becoming thicker and stronger. For our whole life, he thought bitterly. He sat there with his eyes closed as she carefully dabbed various perfumes onto his fluffy collar, his cheeks, his forehead, and his hair. Then she said, "You didn't even ask me how I slept." "How did you sleep, little one?" "I had a dream. You know, a scary, scary dream." The wall became as thick as a castle wall. "That's how it always is in a new place," Rumata said artificially. "And the Baron was probably making a ruckus downstairs." "Should I order breakfast?" she asked. "Please. And what kind of wine do you like in the morning?" Rumata opened his eyes. "Order some water," he said. I don't drink in the morning." She went out, and he heard her calm, clear voice speaking to Uno. Then she came back, sat on the arm of his chair, and started to tell him her dream. And he listened, raising his eyebrows, with each minute feeling the wall become thicker and more impregnable, forever separating him from the only person truly dear to him in this hideous world. And then he hurled his whole body at the wall. "Kira," he said, "it wasn't a dream." And nothing in particular happened. "My poor darling," Kira said. "Wait, let me bring you some brine." Chapter 5. It wasn't long ago that the Arkanarian court was one of the most educated in the empire. There had been scientists at court, most of whom were, of course, charlatans, but there had also been some like Bagir of Kisen who had discovered the sphericity of the planet, the healer Tatar, who had made the brilliant conjecture that epidemics come from tiny invisible worms spread by wind and water, and the alchemist Sinda, who, like all alchemists, had been in search of a way to transform clay into gold, but instead had discovered the law of conservation of matter. The Arkanarian court had also had poets, mostly footlickers and sycophants, but some like Pepin the Glorious, the author of the historical tragedy The March to the North, Zuren the Truthful, who had composed more than 500 ballads and sonnets that had been set to music by the people, and also Ger the Storyteller, who had written the first secular novel in the history of the empire, the sad story of a prince who had fallen in love with a beautiful barbarian. The court also used to have marvellous actors, dancers, and singers. Wonderful artists had covered the walls with unfading frescoes. Fabulous sculptors had decorated the palace parks with their creations. You couldn't say that the Arkanarian kings had been enthusiastic supporters of education or connoisseurs of the arts. It had simply been considered the decent thing to do, like the ceremony of dressing in the morning, or the presence of splendid guards by the main entrance. Aristocratic tolerance would occasionally go so far as to allow scientists and poets to become visible cogs in the state apparatus. Thus, only half a century ago, the highly learned alchemist Botsa had occupied the now abolished as unneeded position of Minister of Mineral Resources, founded a number of mines, and made Arkanar famous for its amazing alloys, the secret of which had been lost after his death. And Pepin the Glorious had been in charge of public education until very recently, when the Ministry of History and Literature, which he had headed, had been discovered to be harmful and guilty of corrupting minds. Of course, even in years past, there had been occasions where a scientist or artist who had displeased the king's mistress, a dull and lascivious creature, was sold abroad or poisoned with arsenic. But only Don Reber had set to work in earnest. During his tenure as the all-powerful Minister of the Defence of the Crown, he had caused such devastation in the world of Arkanarian culture that he had even managed to displease some of the noble lords, who declared that court had become boring, and that balls were now only good for mindless gossip. Bagir of Kisen, accused of lunacy bordering on treason, had been thrown in a dungeon and had only been rescued by Rumata with great difficulty. He had been sent to the metropole, but his observatory had been burned down and his surviving students had dispersed. The healer Tatar, along with 5 other healers, had suddenly turned out to be poisoners who had been plotting against the king at the instigation of the Duke of Irukan. Tatar had confessed to everything under torture and was hanged in the royal plaza. In the process of trying to save him, Rumata had spent 70 pounds of gold, lost 4 agents, noble dons who knew not what they did, and been injured during an attempt to free the prisoners. But he couldn't do a thing. It was his first defeat, after which he had finally realized that Don Reber was not a random figure. After learning a week later that the alchemist Sindar was going to be accused of concealing the philosopher's stone from the treasury, Rumata, enraged by the defeat, had organized an ambush by the alchemist's house. He wrapped a black rag around his face, disarmed the stormtroopers who came to take the alchemist away, tied them up, and threw them in a cellar. He had then sent Sindar, who hadn't understood a thing, into Soan, where he shrugged his shoulders and continued to look for the philosopher's stone under the watchful eye of Don Condor. The poet Pepin the Glorious had suddenly become a monk, and retired to a secluded monastery. Zuren the Truthful, pronounced guilty of criminal innuendo and pandering to the tastes of the lower classes, had been stripped of honour and property. The poet had attempted to dispute the findings, and read his now openly subversive ballads in pubs, and had twice been beaten half to death by patriotic individuals. Only then had he yielded to the entreaties of his good friend and fan Don Rumata and left for the metropole. Rumata would always remember him, bluish-white from drink, standing on the deck of a departing ship, clutching the rigging with his thin hands, and in a clear, young voice shouting his farewell sonnet. "As a wilted leaf falls on my soul." As for Gur the storyteller, after a conversation in Don Reber's office, he had realized that an Arkanarian prince couldn't have fallen in love with enemy scum, and threw his own books into a fire on the Royal Plaza. And now, hunched and dead-faced, he would stand in the crowd of courtiers during the king's appearances, and at a small gesture from Don Reber would step forward with poems of ultra-patriotic content, inducing boredom and yawns. The actors now only performed one play, The Fall of the Barbarians, or Marshal Tots, King Pitts the First of Arkanar, and the singers now preferred songs without lyrics, accompanied by an orchestra. The surviving artists daubed signs. However, 2 or 3 of them had managed to remain at court, and painted portraits of the king with Don Reber respectfully supporting him by the elbow. Originality was not encouraged. The king was always depicted as a dashing 20-year-old in armour, and Don Reber as a man in his prime with a significant face. Yes, the Arkanarian court had become boring. Nonetheless, lords, noble dons with nothing to do, officers of the guard, and thoughtless, beautiful donyas continued to fill the palace reception halls each morning, some out of vanity, others out of habit, still others out of fear. To be perfectly honest, many of them didn't notice any changes at all. In the concerts and poetry competitions of times past, they had most of all appreciated the intermissions, during which the noble dons could debate the merits of their hunting dogs and tell jokes. They were capable of a brief discussion about the attributes of the creatures of the netherworld, but questions about the shape of the planet or the causes of epidemics were considered simply indecent. The officers of the guard did feel somewhat dejected about the disappearance of the painters, some of whom had been masters at depicting the nude form. Rumata got to the palace a little late. The morning reception had already begun. The halls swarmed with people, and he could hear the king's peevish voice and the melodious commands of the Minister of Ceremonies, who was in charge of dressing His Majesty. The courtiers mostly talked about last night's incident. Some criminal with Irukanian features had infiltrated the palace armed with a stiletto, killed a watchman, and burst into His Majesty's bedchamber, where he was ostensibly disarmed by Don Reber himself. He was then torn to pieces by a crowd of patriots, maddened by their devotion on the way to the Merry Tower. This was the 6th assassination attempt over the last month, and therefore the fact of the attempt itself elicited almost no interest. Only the details were under discussion. Rumata learned that at the sight of the murderer, His Majesty had sat up in bed, shielding the beautiful Doña Midara with his body, and uttered the historic words, "Get along, rascal!" The majority willingly believed in the historic words, assuming that the king took the murderer for a footman, and everyone agreed that Don Reber was, as always, on his guard and incomparable in hand-to-hand combat. Rumata made some gracious remarks in concurrence with this opinion, and in response told a just-invented story about how Don Reba had been attacked by 12 robbers, 3 of whom he felled on the spot, and the rest of whom had fled. The story was listened to with great interest and approval, after which Rumata mentioned seemingly casually that the story had been told to him by Don Serra. The interested expressions immediately disappeared from the faces of those present, for they were all aware that Don Serra was a noted fool and liar. No one said a word about Doña Ocana. Either they didn't know about it yet, or were pretending not to know about it. Scattering courtesies and shaking ladies' hands, Rumata gradually moved into the front rows of the decked-out, perfumed, profusely sweating crowd. The noble gentry were chatting in low voices.
Yes, that same mare. It was lame, but I'll be damned if I didn't lose it the very same night to Don Q. As for the hips, my noble Don, they are of an extraordinary shape. As it is said by Zurin, mountains of cool foam, no, cool hills of foam. Anyway, tremendous hips.
Then I gently open the window, take the dagger in my teeth, and imagine, my friend, I feel the lattice bending beneath me.
I gave him a good crack on the teeth with the sword hilt, making that grey dog roll over twice. Feast your eyes on him standing there as if he has the right. And Don Tomeo barfed onto the table, slipped, and fell head first in the fireplace. So then the monk says to her, "Tell me your dream, beautiful."
What a terrible shame, thought Rumata. If I'm killed now, this colony of simpletons will be the last thing I ever see. Only the element of surprise. The element of surprise will save me and Budach. Seize the moment and make a surprise attack. Catch him off his guard. Don't let him open his mouth. Don't let him kill me. I have absolutely no wish to die. He made his way to the doors of the bedchamber, and, holding his swords with both hands, bending his knees slightly as required by etiquette, approached the king's bed. The king's stockings were being pulled on. The Minister of Ceremonies, holding his breath, was closely watching the nimble-fingered hands of the 2 valets. Don Reba stood in front of the messy bed and was quietly conversing with a tall, bony man in a military uniform of grey velvet. This was Father Zupik, one of the leaders of the Arkanarian stormtroopers, a colonel of the palace guards. Don Reba was an experienced courtier. Judging by his face, the conversation was about nothing more important than the paces of a mare or the virtuous behaviour of the king's niece. Father Zupik, on the other hand, as a military man and a former grocer, didn't know how to control his face. He darkened and bit his lip. His fingers on the sword hilt would clench and unclench, and he finally jerked his cheek, spun around, and, breaking every rule, left the bedchamber heading right at the crowd of courtiers, shocked into stillness by such bad manners. Don Rumata, smiling apologetically, watched him leave, and Rumata followed him with his eyes and thought, "There goes another dead man." He was aware of the tensions between Don Reba and the Grey leadership. The story of brown-shirt leader Ernst Röhm was about to be repeated. The stockings had been pulled on. The valets, obeying the melodious order of the Minister of Ceremonies, had reverently picked up the king's shoes with their fingertips. At this point, the king, kicking the valets away, turned toward Don Reba so abruptly that his stomach, which resembled an overstuffed sack, rolled onto one of his knees.
"I'm tired of your assassinations!"
he screeched hysterically.
"Assassinations! Assassinations! I want to sleep at night, not fight off murderers. Why can't we make it so they do it during the day? You're a crummy minister, Reba. Another night like that, and I'll give the order to strangle you."
Don Reba bowed, pressing his hand to his heart as the king continued.
"Assassination attempts give me a headache."
The king suddenly stopped and stared vacantly at his stomach. The moment was right. The valets were hesitating. First, Rumata had to draw attention to himself. He snatched the right shoe from the hand of a valet, dropped to one knee before the king, and started to respectfully place the shoe onto the pudgy, silk-covered foot. This was the ancient privilege of Rumata's family, putting on the right shoe of the crowned heads of the empire. The king was looking at him dully. A spark of interest appeared in his eyes.
"Ah, Rumata,"
he said.
"You're still alive? And Rayber promised to strangle you."
He giggled.
"He's a crummy minister, that Rayber. All he does is make promises. He promised to eradicate insubordination, and insubordination keeps growing. He's stuffed the palace full of some grey bumpkins. I'm sick, and he's hanged all the healers."
Rumata finished putting on the shoe, and took 2 steps back, bowing. He noticed Don Rayber eyeing him closely, and hastened to assume a haughtily vacant expression.
"I'm very sick,"
continued the king.
"Everything hurts. I want to retire to rest. I would have long since retired to rest, but you dolts would be lost without me."
His second shoe had been put on. He stood up and immediately gasped, grimacing, and clutched his knee.
"Where are the healers?"
he wailed mournfully.
"Where's my good Tatar? You hanged him, moron. The sound of his voice alone made me feel better. Silence! I already know he was a poisoner, and I don't give a damn. Who cares that he was a poisoner? He was a healer, get it? Murderer, a healer. He'd poison one, heal another, and you only know how to persecute. You ought to have hanged yourself instead."
Don Rayber bowed, pressing his hand to his heart, and stayed in this position.
"You've hanged everyone. There are only charlatans left, and the priests who give me holy water instead of medicine. Who'll make the potions? Who'll rub the salve into my foot?"
"Sire," Rumata said loudly, and it seemed to him that the whole palace went still. "You only need to give the order, and the best healer in the empire will be in the palace in half an hour." The king stared at him in bewilderment. It was an awful risk. Don Rayber had only to blink. Rumata knew why there was a row of round black vents under the bedroom's ceiling. He could feel the number of eyes looking at him intently over the fletchings of their arrows. Don Rayber was also looking at him with an expression of polite and benevolent curiosity.
"What's the meaning of this?"
the king inquired testily.
"All right, I give the order. All right, where's your healer?"
Rumata felt his whole body tense up. It seemed to him that the arrows were already pricking his shoulder blades. "Sire," he said quickly, "order Don Rayber to present the famous Dr. Budach to you." Apparently Don Rayber really had been caught off guard. The most important thing had been said, and Rumata was still alive. The king shifted his bleary gaze to the Minister of the Defence of the Crown. "Sire," Rumata continued, no longer in a hurry and using appropriate language, "being aware of your truly unbearable suffering, and bearing in mind the debt my family has to the Crown, I sent for the highly learned healer Dr. Budach from Irukan. However, unfortunately Dr. Budach's journey was interrupted. The grey soldiers of the Honourable Don Rayber captured him last week, and his further fate is known only to Don Rayber. I would assume that the healer is somewhere close at hand, most likely in the Merry Tower, and I hope that Don Rayber's strange aversion to healers has not yet had a fatal effect on Dr. Budach's destiny." Rumata paused, holding his breath. Everything seemed to have gone off without a hitch. Watch out, Don Rayber. He took a look at the minister and went cold. The Minister of the Defence of the Crown had in no way been caught off his guard. He was nodding at Rumata with affectionate paternal reproach. Rumata hadn't expected this at all. "Why, he's delighted," thought Rumata in bewilderment. The king, on the other hand, was behaving as expected.
"You rogue!"
He screamed at Don Raber.
"I'll strangle you! Where's the doctor? Where's the doctor, I ask? Silence! I'm asking, where's the doctor?"
Don Raber stepped forward, smiling pleasantly. "Your Majesty," he said, "you're a truly fortunate monarch, for you have so many loyal subjects that they occasionally interfere with each other in their efforts to serve you." The king was staring at him vacantly. "I will admit that, as with everything else that happens in your country, I was aware of the noble plan of the fiery Don Rumata. I will admit that I sent our grey soldiers to meet Dr. Budach, solely for the purpose of sparing a venerable old man the trials of a long journey. I will also admit that I was in no hurry to present Budach of Irukan to your Majesty."
"How dare you?"
the king asked reproachfully. "Your Majesty, Don Rumata is young, and is as naive in politics as he's experienced in noble battle. He is unaware of the lows the Duke of Irukan would stoop to in his insane fury at your Majesty, but you and I know this, sire, do we not?" The king nodded. "And therefore I felt it incumbent upon me to make a preliminary investigation. I would not be in a hurry, but if you, your Majesty—" A low bow to the king, and Don Rumata, a nod in Rumata's direction, "so insist, then this very day after dinner Dr. Budach will appear before you, your Majesty, to begin a course of treatment."
"You're no fool, Don Raber,"
the king said, thinking about it.
"An investigation is a good thing. It can't hurt. Damn that Irukanian!"
He howled and grabbed his knee again.
"Damn this leg! So after dinner, then? We'll be waiting.
And the king, leaning on the shoulder of the Minister of Ceremonies, slowly walked toward the throne room past a stunned Rumata. As he entered the crowd of courtiers, which parted in front of him, Don Raber smiled amiably at Rumata and asked, "I believe you're on duty tonight at the prince's bedchamber. Am I not mistaken?" Rumata silently bowed. Rumata wandered aimlessly through the endless corridors and passages of the palace, dark, dank, and stinking of ammonia and decay. He walked past luxurious rooms decorated with rugs, past dusty studies with barred, narrow windows, and past storerooms piled with junk stripped of gilding. There was almost no one here. Only the rare courtier would risk visiting this maze at the back of the palace, where the royal apartments imperceptibly became the offices of the Ministry of the Defence of the Crown. It was easy to get lost here. Everyone remembered the incident in which a patrol of the guard, walking the perimeter of the palace, had been frightened by the heart-rending wails of a man stretching his badly scratched arms through the bars of an embrasure. "Save me!" the man shouted. "I'm a gentleman of the bedchamber. I don't know how to get out. I haven't eaten for 2 days. Get me out of here!" There was a lively 10-day correspondence between the Minister of Finances and the Minister of the Court, after which they did decide to break down the bars. But for the duration of these 10 days, the unfortunate gentleman of the bedchamber had been fed with meat and bread passed to him on the end of a pike. Besides, it wasn't entirely safe. In these tight corridors you could meet drunk guardsmen who were protecting the king's person, and drunk stormtroopers who were protecting the ministry. These would fight tooth and nail, and when satisfied would go their separate ways carrying away the wounded. Finally, the murdered also wandered here. Over 2 centuries the palace had accumulated a lot of them. A stormtrooper on sentry duty stepped out from a deep recess in the wall, his axe at the ready. "You may not pass," he declared sullenly. "A lot you know, fool," Rumata said carelessly, pushing him aside. He heard the stormtrooper stomping indecisively behind him, and suddenly caught himself thinking that insulting words and careless gestures now came naturally to him, that he was no longer playing the role of a high-born boor, but had largely become one. He imagined himself like this on earth and felt disgusted and ashamed. Why? What has happened to me? Where did it go, my nurtured since childhood respect and trust in my own kind, in man, the amazing creature called man? Nothing can help me now, he thought in horror, because I sincerely hate and despise them. Not pity them, no, only hate and despise. I can justify the stupidity and brutality of the kid I just passed all I want, the social conditions, the appalling upbringing, anything at all. But I now clearly see that he's my enemy, the enemy of all that I love, the enemy of my friends, the enemy of what I hold most sacred. And I don't hate him theoretically as a typical specimen, but him as himself, him as an individual. I hate his slobbering mug, the stink of his unwashed body, his blind faith, his animosity toward everything other than sex and booze. There he goes, stomping around the oaf who half a year ago was still being thrashed by a fat-bellied father in a vain attempt to prepare him for selling stale flour and old jam. He's wheezing, the dumb lug, struggling to recall the paragraphs of badly crammed regulations, and he just can't figure out whether he's supposed to cut the noble Don down with his axe, shout stop, or just forget about it. No one will find out anyway, so he'll forget about it. Go back to his recess, stuff some chewing bark into his mouth and chew it loudly, drooling and smacking his lips. And there's nothing that he wants to know. And there's nothing he wants to think about. Think! And is our eagle, Don Reber, any better? Yes, of course, his psychology is more intricate, and his reflexes are more complicated. But his thoughts are like these palace mazes, reeking of ammonia and crime. And he himself is just foul beyond expression, a dreadful, criminal, and shameless spider. I came here to love people, to help them unbend, see the sky. No, I'm not a bad operative, he thought remorsefully. I'm a no-good historian. When exactly did I manage to fall into the swamp that Don Condor was talking about? Does a god have the right to feel anything other than pity? He heard a hurried clomp, clomp, clomp of boots along the corridor behind him. Rumata turned around and crossed his arms, placing his hands on the hilts of his swords. He saw Don Repat running toward him, holding on to the blade at his side.
Don Rumata! Don Rumata!
He cried from afar in a hoarse whisper. Rumata let go of his swords. When he got close, Don Repat took a look around and, in a barely audible voice, said in his ear, "I've been looking for you for an entire hour. Wag of the Wheel is in the palace. He's having a conversation with Don Reber in the lilac quarters." Rumata even squeezed his eyes shut for a second. Then, cautiously moving away, he said with polite surprise, "You mean the famous robber? But he's either been executed or was invented to begin with." The lieutenant licked his dry lips. "He's real. He's in the palace. I thought you'd like to know." "My dearest Don Repat," Rumata said impressively, "I'm interested in rumours, gossip, jokes. Life can be so boring. You have clearly misunderstood me." The lieutenant looked at him with wild eyes. "Judge for yourself," Rumata went on. "Why should I care about the unsavoury relationships of Don Reber, who, however, I respect too much to presume to judge? Besides, I apologize, I'm in a hurry. There's a lady waiting for me." Don Repat licked his lips again, gave an awkward bow, and sidled away. Rumata was suddenly struck by a happy thought. "By the way, my friend," he called out amiably, "how did you like the little intrigue that Don Reber and I carried out this morning?" Don Repat stopped eagerly. "We are very pleased," he said. "It was very charming, don't you think?" "It was magnificent. The Grey officers are very glad that you have finally openly taken our side. You're such an intelligent man, Don Rumata, and yet you consort with barons, with noble bastards." "My dear Repat," Rumata said haughtily, turning to walk away. You forget that from the height of my birth I see absolutely no difference even between the king and yourself. Goodbye." He strode through the corridors, making confident turns and silently pushing sentries aside. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he realized that this was a piece of astonishing rare luck. He had to listen to the conversation between the two spiders. No wonder Don Raber had asked 14 times as much for Wagga alive than for Wagga dead. 2 grey lieutenants, their blades drawn, stepped out toward him from the lilac curtains. "Hello, friends," Don Rumata said, stopping between them. "Is the minister here?"
"The minister is busy, Don Rumata," said one of the lieutenants.
"I'll wait," Rumata said. He passed through the curtains. It was pitch black. Rumata groped his way between the chairs, tables, and iron lampstands. A number of times he distinctly heard someone huffing by his ear, and was enveloped in a rich odour of garlic and beer. Then he saw a faint streak of light, heard Honourable Wagga's familiar tenor, and stopped. At that instant the end of a spear gently poked him between the shoulder blades. "Quiet, blockhead," he said irritably but softly. "It's me, Don Rumata." The spear was removed. Rumata dragged a chair towards the streak of light, sat down, stretching his legs, and yawned loudly enough to be heard. Then he began to watch. The spiders had met. Don Raber was sitting in a tense posture, his elbows resting on the desk and his fingers interlaced. A heavy throwing knife with a wooden handle was lying on top of a pile of papers to his right. The minister was wearing a pleasant, although somewhat dazed, smile. Honourable Wagga was sitting on a sofa with his back to Rumata. He looked like an eccentric, aged nobleman who hadn't left his country palace for the past 30 years.
"The chuntit will slake," he said, "and they'll unbiggedly shump the margays with a hollow blackery. That's 20 long heapers already. It'd be marky to knock the mutliners, but the heapers are bedegging readily. This is how we'll heaten the rastin, that's our struntle."
Don Raber stroked his clean-shaven chin. "That's tooky jelly." Wagga shrugged.
"This is our struntle. Denuding with us isn't rastinly for your gnorpers, it's revided."
"It's revided," said the Minister of the Defence of the Crown decisively.
"And drink the circle,"
Wagga said, getting up. Rumata, who was listening to this gibberish dumbfounded, discovered a bushy moustache and a pointy grey beard on Wagga's face. A true courtier from the time of the last regency.
"It was nice to talk to you," said Wagga.
Don Raber also got up. "The conversation with you gave me great pleasure," he said. "I have never before seen a man as courageous as yourself. Honourable—"
"Me too," said Wagga in a bored voice. "I'm also amazed and proud of the courage of the First Minister of our kingdom."
He turned his back on Don Raber and shuffled toward the door, leaning on his staff. Don Raber, continuing to look at him pensively, absent-mindedly placed his fingers on the handle of the knife. Someone behind Rumata's back immediately took an extremely deep breath, and the long brown barrel of a blowpipe squeezed past his ear toward the gap between the curtains. Don Raber remained standing for a second as if listening. Then he sat back down, opened a drawer, extracted a pile of paper, and became absorbed in his reading. The man behind Rumata's back spat on the floor. The blowpipe was removed. Everything was clear. The spiders had agreed. Rumata got up and, stepping on somebody's feet, started making his way back out from the lilac quarters. The king dined in a huge hall with 2 tiers of windows. The 90-foot table was set for 100 people. The king himself, Don Raber, the royals, 24 full-blooded individuals, gluttons and drunks, the minister of the court and the minister of ceremonies, a group of high-born aristocrats invited by tradition, this included Rumata, a dozen visiting barons with their ox-like baronets, and at the very end of the table various aristocratic small fry who had somehow finagled an invitation to the royal dinner. When these last were being handed their invitations and chair numbers, they were warned. Sit still, the king doesn't like it when people fidget. Keep your hands on the table, the king doesn't like it when people hide their hands under the table. Don't look around, the king doesn't like it when people look around. At every such dinner, vast quantities of fine food were devoured, whole lakes of ancient wines were drunk, and masses of dishes made from the famous Estorian china were damaged or broken. In one of his reports to the king, the Minister of Finance bragged that just one of His Majesty's dinners costs as much as maintaining the Soanian Academy of Science for half a year. While he waited for the Minister of Ceremonies to proclaim "to the table" 3 times, accompanied by trumpets, Rumata stood in a group of courtiers and listened for the 10th time to Don Tameo's story about the royal dinner that he, Don Tameo, had the honour to attend 6 months ago. I find my seat. We stand up. The king comes in, sits down. We also sit down. The dinner goes on as usual. And suddenly, imagine this, my dear Dons. I feel something wet underneath me. Yes, wet. I don't dare turn around, squirm, or feel it with my hand. However, I find an opportunity to stick a hand underneath me, and what happens? It really is wet. I smell my hand. It doesn't smell like anything in particular. What a fable! Meanwhile, everyone is getting up, and as you can imagine, noble Dons, I am somehow afraid to get up. I see the king himself, walking toward me, but I keep sitting, as if I were a bumpkin baron without any manners. His Majesty comes up to me, smiles indulgently at me, and puts his hand on my shoulder. "My dear Don Tameo," he says, "everyone has gotten up and is about to go to watch the ballet, but you're still sitting down. What's wrong? Did you eat too much?" "Your Majesty," I say, "chop my head off, but something is wet underneath me." His Majesty was so gracious as to laugh and order me to stand up. I get up, and what happens? Laughter all around. Noble Dons, I had been sitting on rum cake for the whole dinner. His Majesty was so gracious as to laugh a lot. "Reba," he said finally, "these are all your jokes. Would you be so kind as to clean the noble Don up? You soiled his seat." Don Reba, laughing uproariously, takes out a dagger and starts scraping the cake off my pants. Can you imagine my condition, noble Dons? I won't deny it. I was shaking in fear at the thought that Don Reba, humiliated in front of everyone, would take revenge on me. Fortunately, nothing happened. I assure you, noble Dons, this was the happiest experience of my life. How the king laughed! How his Majesty was pleased! The courtiers roared with laughter. In fact, such jokes were customary at the royal table. The invitees would be seated in pâtés, in chairs with sawed-off legs, on goose eggs. They'd been seated on poisoned needles, too. The king liked to be amused. Rumata suddenly thought, I wonder what I would have done in this idiot's place. I'm afraid that the king would have had to look for another Minister of Defence, and the Institute would have had to send another man to Arkady. In any case, I need to be on my guard, like our eagle Don Reba. The trumpet sounded, the Minister of Ceremonies bellowed melodiously, the king limped in, and everyone began to take their seats. The guardsmen on duty were standing motionless in the corners of the hall, leaning on their two-handed swords. Rumata got taciturn neighbours. On his right, the seat was filled with the quivering bulk of the sullen glutton Don Pifar, the husband of the well-known beauty, and on his left, Ger the storyteller was staring at an empty plate. The guests paused, looking at the king. The king stuffed a greyish napkin in his collar, scanned the dishes, and grabbed a chicken leg. As soon as he sank his teeth into it, 100 knives fell onto plates with a clatter, and 100 hands reached for dishes. The hall became full of chomping and sucking sounds. Wine started gurgling. The moustaches of the motionless guardsmen with the two-handed swords began to twitch avidly. Once upon a time, Rumata had gotten nauseated at these dinners. Now he was used to them. Carving a shoulder of mutton with his dagger, he glanced right and immediately turned away. Don Pifar was hanging over an entire roasted wild boar, working like an excavator. He left no bones. Rumata held his breath and drained his glass of Irukanian wine in one gulp. Then he glanced left. Ger the storyteller was listlessly picking at a small plate of salad with a spoon. "Are you writing anything new, Father Ger?" Rumata asked in a low voice. Ger started. "Writing? Me? I don't know. A lot." "Poetry?" "Yes, poetry." "Your poetry is abominable, Father Ger." Ger looked at him strangely. Yes, you're no poet." "No poet. Sometimes I wonder who am I, and what am I afraid of? I don't know." "Look at your plate and keep eating. I'll tell you who you are. You're a brilliant storyteller, the founder of a new literary movement, the most fruitful one there is." Ger's cheeks slowly started to glow. "In 100 years, and maybe even earlier, dozens of storytellers will follow in your footsteps." "God help them," Ger blurted out. "Now I'll tell you what you're afraid of." "I'm afraid of the dark." "Of the night time?" "Of the night time, too. At night we're at the mercy of spirits. But most of all I'm afraid of the dark, because in the dark everyone becomes equally grey." "Very well put, Father Ger. By the way, is it still possible to find your book?" "I don't know, and I don't want to know." "Just in case, you should know. One copy is in the Metropole, in the Library of the Emperor. Another is kept in the Museum of Curiosities in Soan. The third is with me." Ger spooned some jelly onto his plate with a trembling hand. I don't know." He looked at Rumata mournfully with his huge sunken eyes. "I'd like to read it. Reread it." "I'll be happy to lend it to you." "And then?" "And then you'll give it back." "And then you'll be given back," Ger said sharply. Rumata shook his head. "Don Reba really scared you, Father Ger." "Scared me? Have you ever had to burn your own children? What do you know about fear, noble Don?" "I bow my head before what you've had to go through, Father Ger, but I wholeheartedly blame you for giving up." Ger the storyteller suddenly started to whisper so softly that Rumata could barely hear him over the chomping and the drone of voices. "And what is it all for? What is the truth? Prince Har really did love the beautiful copper-skinned Yevnivora. They had kids. I know they're grandchildren. She really was poisoned, but I was told that it's a lie. I was told the truth is what currently benefits the king. Everything else is a lie and a crime. I had written lies all my life, and only now do I write the truth." He suddenly stood up and loudly recited in a sing-song voice, "Great and glorious like eternity is our king, whose name is nobility. Infinity is in retreat, and birthright signalling defeat." The king stopped chewing and stared at him vacantly. The guests pulled their heads into their shoulders. Only Don Reba smiled and gave a few silent claps. The king spit the bones onto the tablecloth and said,
"Infinity? That's right. That's true. It's in retreat. I commend you. You may eat."
The chomping and conversations resumed. Ger sat down. "It's so sweet and easy to tell the truth to the king's face," he croaked. Rumata was silent. Then he said, "I'll give you a copy of your book, Father Ger, but under one condition. You will immediately start writing the next one." "No," Ger said. "It's too late. Let Kian write. I've been poisoned. And anyway, I'm not interested in any of it anymore. I only want one thing now. To learn to drink. And I can't. It hurts my stomach." Another defeat, thought Rumata. I'm too late.
"Listen, Reba,"
the king said suddenly.
"Where's the healer? You promised me the healer after dinner."
"He's here, Your Majesty," said Don Reba. "Do you order me to summon him?"
"Do I order you to? Of course! If your knee hurt like this, you'd squeal like a pig. Get him here this instant."
Rumata leaned back in his chair and got ready to watch. Don Reba raised a hand above his head and snapped his fingers. The door opened, and a hunched old man wearing a long robe adorned with images of silver spiders, stars, and snakes entered the hall, constantly bowing. He was holding a flat, oblong bag under his arm. Rumata was puzzled. This wasn't at all how he had imagined Budach. The sage and humanist, the author of the comprehensive treatise on poisons, couldn't have such faded, darting eyes, such fearfully trembling lips, such a pathetic, ingratiating smile. But then he remembered Ger the storyteller. The inquiry into the suspected Irukanian spy probably involved a literary conversation in Don Reba's office. Oh, to take Reba by the ear, he thought longingly, to drag him into the dungeon, to tell the torturers, "Here's an Irukanian spy disguised as our glorious minister. The king has ordered us to extract the whereabouts of the real minister from him. Do what you do, and woe be upon you if he dies in less than a week." He put a hand in front of his face lest it betray his thoughts. What a terrible thing hatred is.
"Well, well, come here, healer,"
the king said.
"You're a weakling, brother. Now squat. Squat, I tell you."
The unfortunate Budach began to squat. His face contorted in horror.
"Again, again,"
the king said nasally.
"Once again, again. Your knees don't hurt. You healed your own knees. Now let's see your teeth. Not bad. I should have such teeth. And the hands aren't bad, nice and strong, nice and healthy, though you're a weakling. Well, go on, my dear. Treat me, don't just stand there."
Your Majesty, be so gracious as to show his leg. Rumata heard the healer say. He looked up. The man was on his knees in front of the king and was carefully kneading his leg.
"Hey,
the king said.
"What are you doing? Don't paw at me. If you're going to treat me, then treat me."
"I understand everything, Your Majesty," the healer mumbled. He started hurriedly digging through his bag. The guests stopped chewing. The minor aristocrats at the end of the table even stood up and craned their necks, burning with curiosity. Budach took a number of stone bottles from his bag, opened them, and, sniffing them one by one, lined them up along the table. Then he took the king's goblet and filled it halfway with wine. Making strange gestures over the goblet with both hands and whispering incantations, he quickly emptied all the bottles into the wine. The distinct smell of ammonia spread through the hall. The king pursed his lips, looked into the goblet, and, screwing up his nose, looked at Don Reba. The minister smiled sympathetically. The courtiers held their breath. What is he doing? Thought Rumata with surprise. The old man has gout. What is that concoction? His treatise clearly states massage a 3-day infusion of white snake venom into the swollen joints. Maybe this is the salve.
"What's this? Salve?"
the king asked, nervously nodding at the goblet. "Not at all, Your Majesty," said Budach. He had already recovered a little. "This is taken orally."
"Orally?"
The king pouted and leaned back in his chair.
I don't want anything orally. Massage it in.
As you wish, Your Majesty, Budach said meekly. But I must take the liberty to warn you that massaging it in will be of no use.
For some reason, everyone else massages, the king said peevishly. And you absolutely have to pour this stuff into me.
Your Majesty, said Budach, proudly standing up. This medicine is known to me alone. I used it to cure the uncle of the Duke of Irukan. As for the massagers, they certainly didn't cure you, Your Majesty. The king looked at Don Reba. Don Reba again smiled sympathetically.
You rascal,
the king said to the healer in an unpleasant voice.
A bumpkin, a lousy weakling.
He picked up the goblet.
I have half a mind to give you a good crack on the teeth with this goblet.
He looked into the goblet.
And if I throw up?
We'd have to repeat it, Your Majesty, Budach said mournfully.
All right. The Lord be with us,
the king said, bringing the goblet almost to his mouth, but he suddenly jerked it away so abruptly that it splashed onto the tablecloth.
Hey, you drink some first. I know you Irukanians. You sold holy micha to the barbarians. Drink it, I say.
Budach took the goblet with an offended look and drank a few sips.
Well, how is it?
Said the king. It's bitter, Your Majesty, Budach said in a choked voice. But you have to drink it.
Have to? Have to?
The king said peevishly.
I know I have to myself. Hand it over. Look at this, you polished half of it off. Took your chance.
He tossed off the goblet in one gulp. Sympathetic sighs sounded around the table, and suddenly everything went still. The king froze with his mouth open. Tears rained from his eyes. He slowly turned purple, then blue in the face. He stretched out a hand above the table, convulsively snapping his fingers. Don Reba hastily handed him a pickle. The king silently hurled the pickle at Don Reba and again stretched out his hand.
Wine!
He wheezed. Someone dashed off and got the pitcher. The king, his eyes frantically rolling, swallowed loudly. Red rivulets were pouring down his white waistcoat. When the pitcher was empty, the king threw it at Budach, but missed.
Bastard,
he said in an unexpectedly bass voice.
What did you kill me for? Haven't we hanged enough of you? Blast you!
He stopped and touched his knee.
It hurts,
he said in his former nasal voice.
It still hurts.
Your Majesty, said Budach, for a complete cure the potion must be taken every day for at least a week's duration. Something squeaked in the king's throat.
Out!
He shrieked.
Everyone get out!
The courtiers, overturning their chairs, swarmed towards the doors.
Out!
The king screeched, sweeping the dishes off the table. Rumata rushed out of the hall, then ducked behind a curtain and began to laugh. Someone else was also laughing behind the adjacent curtain, hysterically, gasping for breath, with little yelps